If the notion of the urban global south provokes an array of viewpoints, most tend to agree that colonially inherited or borrowed planning frameworks are incapable of addressing the urbanization challenges of cities in the so-called urban global south. In this second video, we ask what kind of planning practices are then called for. Do planning practices in the urban global south require delinking or relinking from Western planning frameworks? If so, does this open up new avenues for emancipatory action? Why? With what consequences? And for whom?
It is hard to think of urban planning as a univocal notion. Urban planning is essentially a tool for the more efficient and equitable distribution of resources within the urban scene, among the urban population. Now, what is more equitable and what is more efficient obviously depend on the views of the different urban actors.
Working in cities outside of Europe and the States, we are working in contexts that are facing, I think, increasingly difficult and complex realities, where a whole lot of really important issues are coming together around urbanization, about inequality, about environmental degradation, about climate change. As planners, we don't have many good ideas on how to tackle them. So I think there's a really urgent need that we start to urge the planning community as a global community to pay a great deal more attention to what is going on outside of where ideas have come from.
The kind of planning that we do and that we have and that we've written about is indeed a planning that's been informed largely by Western experience and written about by Western authors. We also know that that planning is completely incapable of dealing with the realities of this process of very fast urbanization. It's completely incapable of dealing with informality, and indeed in many parts of the world has resulted in actually the majority of the population of cities being labelled illegal, which is clearly a serious problem. So planning itself needs to be rethought and in a sense completely reframed.
The problem with urban planning and urban design is that it's probably the one discipline that has been so rooted in a universalist framework. In the context of Indian cities, planners are yet to acknowledge that Indian cities probably operate differently. And so, for instance, all the master plans that are being produced, they talk about informality as a problem. And the only way to address informality is to remove it. So, you remove street traders, you remove hawkers, you remove slums.
Any narratives, any planning narratives about the urban global south are typically narratives about the failure of planning, are typically narratives about accusations of planning as being inefficient, imperfect, incompetent, and so on. As if you wish, as if the city planning didn't have anything to do with the production of a city in the urban global south. And this is a very striking thought, because whether we, however we categorize, and however we qualify such planning processes, the city is the outcome of planning, even if not the intended outcome of planning. I think that we are constantly trying to, or there is at least a tendency to assess the inadequacy of planning, of course in the light of North imaginaries of what planning should be. So it should be efficient, it should be, it should distribute, it should do a number of things. Planning is not incompetent. Planning in the urban global south is very much embedded in place-based historical political processes that we need to understand.
For me, the differences that I see in looking at cities in the global south as opposed to the north really pertain around the area of informality. And I think it shows itself in different ways in different countries, in different cultures. But if there had to be one thing I would say was a problem, it would be informality. And if you try and take a northern solution and put it into a southern environment, you immediately hit that problem, and it means that things just don't work if you're not careful.
The numbers tell us that cities have become much more informal compared to what these used to be. Our own understanding of city was that they were formal entities, and all the laws and regulations that were made were really how to manage a city, which is a formal thing. Whether it is the planning legislation, whether it is town and planning legislation, whether it is a Factories Act, or you name it. And they were all articulated and brought onto the statutes with the idea that city is a formal entity.
I think as soon as you start talking about informal and formal, you're clearly talking about a dichotomy, and that dichotomy can very easily be intellectually destroyed in terms of the reality, but the terminology itself can be quite useful. It allows, I think, a space in which to kind of articulate the contradictions between the positions that different people find themselves in. And that particularly relates to land development. What you tend to have in a formal system is a control system that doesn't have any cognizance of the dynamics of the informal system, and because the informal system in many contexts represents the majority system, it's only by almost mapping out the balance between the formal and the informal that those huge contradictions arise.
Current theorisations of informality stress the provisional, ephemeral nature of informal settlements, their constant movement towards the as yet unknown, their in-between spaces, neither here nor there, what Rahul Mehrotra calls, therefore, the kinetic city as opposed to the static or formal city. And I have to say that I'm not clear how far, in practical terms, current readings of informality go beyond Turner's recommendations that we should support these processes. For example, by providing things like connections to the city's water and drainage networks that residents can't produce for themselves. I also worry that the emphasis, for example, on mobility and improvisation, on the temporal and the ephemeral, could delegitimise residents' aspirations to permanence and re-legitimise planning responses involving removal and relocation.
What I think is linking the global south and north is the frequency and the size of evictions of the city built by and for the people. And this is a common issue that, unfortunately, when you look at the state of the cities which is being produced, when you look at the slum index to measure progress, what they have in common is that evictions, which are common, we have today, over 1,000 cases which are existing all over the place, that people are being evicted. We are speaking of millions of people. And it's not in the planning system. We are not addressing it. When you look at the market-driven evictions, like the foreclosures in the US, we're speaking of probably 5 million families. So how do you plan a city where you can avoid evicting people? Can you plan a city without evicting?
So there's nothing particularly extraordinary, I would say, about many of the planning practices that circulate around the world. Very often we don't know that shared planning practices exist. So the developmental division of our analysis and practice between the global south and so-called global north leaves us unable to excavate and understand these processes. Planning needs to be unbundled in some ways. And once again, I think there would be some interesting learning opportunities across cities which don't inhabit the same baggy regional categories.
There's certainly a value in looking at other cities in the south if you're trying to understand how to do something in one city. It's useful to look at other cities in the south, but I don't think that's a given that any solution you find there is going to be a solution any more than it would be if you looked at the north. And that can be as irrelevant if you get the idea from another southern city as it is from a northern city. There's no given rule that because it happens to be in a particular geographical location or economic position or whatever, that it is going to deliver you any help whatsoever.
As a planner, I don't think I've come to realize that you almost always we have to intervene without knowing fully what it is that we are intervening in. So that's why rational comprehensive model doesn't work as an approach to problem solving, because you really don't know the problem. You really don't know what type of urban poverty you are addressing till you have grappled with an effort. And as you study the effort, you come to realize what were you trying to solve.
I would see that in the contemporary stage of globalization and capitalism, the challenges for progressive and transformative planning have only increased. So planning should work with elements of and narratives of social urban reform, but should go beyond its restricting boundaries. That is, planning in the urban south cannot limit itself to collaborative, communicative and relational approaches, or the reform of institutions and markets. It should serve as an active instrument in the effective transformations of cities in terms of perhaps subversive strategies, understood in terms of questioning and changing the very relationships between the state, market and society itself.
Any question on planning, on the what is to be done, clearly refers us to the question of agency. And so whose agency is to be deployed if we are to seek any form of transformation? And what are the ambitions of that transformation? What we often find is that every time there is an agenda which is becoming part of a statu quo, which is being, cemented and consolidated, and where planners and the planning systems stop asking questions as to why are we holding this as the desirable way in which cities and trajectories that cities should follow, social movements usually, just kick the board and and bring new issues and new considerations and far more progressive considerations very often to the board.
I think we must learn urgently to recognize the role of social movements, to be more specific, the role of social movements organizations in the context of social movements as planning agents.
The different distribution of resources at the city level has given rise to a new segment of the urban population which has come out of the poverty level which a large majority of the population was in until then. This new sector of the population, which I would refer to as a consuming middle class, is producing, in my view, a complete change within the urban scene.
Previously, in my generation, we were trained in our own countries. Those who taught were trained in Pakistan. Today, those who teach are not trained in Pakistan. They are trained at the DPU, or they are trained somewhere else, I don't know. So that again creates a closer link between them and the institutions in the north. So it changes the relationship between the field and the teacher, but to a lesser extent with the bureaucrat.
Working in teams to construct a collective sort of outcome, of actually more than an outcome process, which can then engage with a given reality and then build grounded theory on that basis, which you can then bring back to your learners. Is something that we're trying to build here, and we're trying to build that first at a micro scale, so it works for particular sets of issues and challenges, and then to try and build it out relatively quickly to work with existing practitioners and with a new generation of scholars and practitioners.
For me, it is more important to think of the planner always within the context of an interdisciplinary team that is equipped with a series of sensibilities. A sensibility that allows them to always be heterodox, in other words, always open to a multiplicity a multiplicity of understandings or readings of the context of the situation, a capacity for heterodoxy in the sense that they're not vested in one particular political ideology or one particular reading, but that they're able to understand different ways in which the political comes into being and in which the political can be activated.
I think we really are talking about the kind of professionals that are required. I don't think we need even more theorizing exclusively about planning as an idea. And I think we need to build a capacity for professionals in lots of different realms of planning, public administration, questions of implementation, a certain sophistication about thinking about the connection between theory and practice, who will return to the state in one form or the other.
For me, I suppose the most important questions that it has to address are the role of the professional planner, and there are many other kinds of planners, would be to ensure that the public good is achieved. Is there a particular difficulty in accessing the public good in the urban global south? It's the question to ask, because if we're going to say there's a role for planning, then we have to be able to say, how does planning identify, name the public good? And I think that for me is the reason why we have to go back to some theoretical ideas as having moral compass. Because if you know what you want to get to, you will have, in some senses, begun to define the public good. Their primary function is to collect knowledge that's in the public good, to weigh knowledge that's in the public good, to inform decision making, and to put measures in place which stop people doing things which are not in the collective interest. And if planners can do that, I think it'd be quite nice to be a planner.